be the way out! The door Aaron had pushed open slowly swung shut behind him as he took in his surroundings. Before him was a long corridor, only a couple of feet wide and just tall enough for him not to scrape the top of his head against the ceiling. On both the left and right walls, stretching on for what looked like an eternity, were pipes. They ranged from fist size to the width of a grown man's arm, and lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Above him, there were thicker ones with tiny gaps between them to let down the small light bulbs wrapped in wire cages. The illumination they gave was muted and dulled by the thick layer of filth covering them, giving their white light a deep orange and red cast. The sounds of water dripped all around, and he could hear something pushed through the pipes beside him. At most times it made gurgling noises as it moved past, and other times it screeched past him. The air was oppressively hot. It made Aaron sweat so that it drenched his hair and naked body. Despite being alone, he couldn't help feel uneasy and even more vulnerable than if he were in a crowded street. Below him, at knee depth, was a thick liquid. It was black with tiny white bubbled patches. It reeked terribly. He wearily slogged through it, one sloshing step at a time, as his shoulders and elbows scraped against the pipes on all sides. A turn was coming up ahead. God, I need to find a way out of this place. How? How did I even get here? Aaron tried desperately to remember how he came to this labyrinth of pipes and hallways. How long have I been down here? He tried to think back of the room he had just come through. In the fog of his tired mind, he remembered only that it had looked almost exactly as this one. He also had the uneasy and chilling feeling that he had left something horrible behind that door. But God help him, he couldn't remember why. At the turn of the corner, the corridor grew slightly tighter. The ceiling was lower, causing Aaron to stoop, and the width had gone close enough to force him to walk sideways. There was a stench in the air, a coppery, sickly sweet smell that filled his nostrils. It was almost tangible, and he felt it cling to the most tender parts of him. What is that stink? It reminds me of
home.
The voice that emanated seemed to come from all sides, reverberating in his head and his body. He tried to turn around, but found his shoulders caught between the piped walls. Scraping hard against the metal, he shouted in pain. He turned his head, trying to crane back and see what had come up from behind him. Images ran through his head, some hopeful, of some poor soul trapped down here with him. Nothing. Had he imagined it? He kept moving, sloshing his way through the murk, rubbing and scraping against the pipes on all sides, occasionally bonking his head on the lights. Hadn't they been higher before? Pushing through further, he came to another turn. This time, the lights were less plentiful. It plunged the corridor into a deeper darkness with occasional pools of the sad orange glows. At least the silver lining was that this way he wouldn't have to duck as often. But God help him. Still no exit. As he moved through the stuff below him, Aaron made a wretched realization. Where it had only covered his shins, it was now lapping at mid-thigh. As he moved onward, he felt the need to hunch over. The ceiling, he realized, was at a decline, slowly progressing down. Aaron began to shiver despite the heat. His stomach had slowly been turning at the subconscious thoughts, and soon those thoughts could no longer be ignored. The walls on either side had closed in further. By degrees, he had been turning and turning, moving his body until he was only walking sideways in slow, steady steps. His ears were starting to push against the walls as well. He couldn't stand this feeling. His chest was starting to hurt, unable to breathe.
At least it's a sensation, right? That is what you live for.
Again, the voice. Again, behind him. He couldn't look back. His head was too tightly pressed, and he'd only be able to turn his head around if he broke open his nose. "Who are you?" he asked.
That hurts.
He felt something press hot hands against the shoulder he couldn't look over. He screamed. Now, he had no other choice. He had to keep moving and going. He pushed forward as much as he could. His ears and temples, chest and back, his buttocks and genitals, his thighs, all scratching and scraping and burning with pain from the friction of the pipes on either side of him. He began to shiver uncontrollably. What if he never let loose? What if this was all there was, and eventually he'd be stuck at a dead end? His heart began to thump loud and rapid. What if he had to move backwards, unable to see? His breath was becoming short. He couldn't breathe. His vision was beginning to blur. The walls suddenly opened up. With a gasp of air, he felt his entire body turn clockwise to face full forward. The surprise of being able to correct himself was so sudden, he lost his balance and fell face first into the thick, fouled liquid. It stung horribly at all of his body's many scrapes and cuts from before. He felt the panic that some horrible filth, or worse, terrible, minuscule creatures that this stuff contained was filling his veins, intruding into his body unchecked. He gasped still for air as he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, though much of his body he found was still submerged in the muck. He looked back finally. He could see down the corridor he had come from. A row no wider than the hard cover of a book, it seemed. He tried to see what had called out to him, what had touched him. In the last pool of light that he had stepped through, something was emerging from the water. It was shaped like a bald man's head, but for some reason it never broke through. Instead, it just continuously pushed up, as if it were kept at bay by something below, struggling to come above and break the liquid, the surface tension giving the impression of a black, silken veil. Who are you?" The thing in the filth turned its head towards Aaron.
Don't you recognize me, my love? Are you going to try and run away again?
The tension broke. Hundreds of whip-like tendrils erupted from where the head had been, tearing at everything and breaking the lights above as it started to move forward. Aaron screamed. He tried to stand up to run, but found he could not. The corridor before him was missing something. Lights. He hadn't seen that the ceiling here was at a sharper decline as he bashed his head against it. He was resolved to only be able to crawl. He moved as quickly as he could, the filth lapping against his cheeks and entering his mouth. It tasted of human body fluids and familiar chemicals that escaped his memory. He crawled and crawled, feeling his hands and knees scraping against whatever ancient floor was below him. He stopped as his face hit something solid yet again. The ceiling dropped ahead of him. He had to push his head underneath into the filth if he was to move forward. God save him. He froze for a moment, considering his options. Then his mind was made up for him. Something behind him grabbed at his foot. It felt like a hot hand at first, but it quickly registered as a mass of whip-like things trying to wrap around his appendage. He screamed and kicked back, doing so propelling him forward, and in order to not bash himself again, he ducked down into the murk. It filled his nostrils and mouth. The rush of the liquid zooming past his ears sounded like 1,000 shouting voices. No, 1,000 voices screaming. He moved forward, still crawling. The above was dipping again. He was wriggling his way as the floor and ceiling pressed down against him. The walls started to press against him again. Then soon enough, he was stuck. Submerged in the disgusting filth, unable to move, unable to see, unable to breathe, unable to scream. He wanted to escape. He tried to push back, but no. He was irreparably trapped. His panicked mind raced with images of the thing behind him, closing the distance. He could not hear anything except the liquid by his ears. Why was it still rushing by him? He had stopped moving. For a moment he had hoped, at least in his soon-to-be death, that it would be silent. But no, the filth still screamed. Then he started to make out words.
Why? Aaron, what did you do? Aaron, we were nice to you. Aaron, do you want? Aaron, do you want me? Aaron, do you love me?
Aaron had only moments to think on the words when it grabbed his ankles. He kicked with what little strength he had left. In a hopeless situation, still fighting. It did not yield. It slowly moved over him, seemingly enveloping his entire body in its corrupted touch. He felt it right at his ear.
Don't you hear them, my love? Everyone who loved you, everyone you didn't love, and now here I am with you. The one person who could ever truly love you like you loved me.
He tried to scream. The tendrils lapped at his face and pooled at the corners of his mouth as more of the filth rushed in to fill it.
Why do you run away still? When will you admit your love for me? That's all I want. Admit you love me as I love you.
He tried to bash his head against the ceiling, the floor. Why hadn't he passed out yet?
You hurt me, Aaron. You still won't admit it. Again I have to let you go. Again, for the 651st but I'll be waiting. You'll come around soon, I know.
And suddenly, he felt free, pushed forward, the creature behind him no longer holding him, and the ceilings and walls and floors no longer keeping him in place. With all his might, he lifted himself up. He broke the surface and found himself in a small, dark corridor. He looked cleaner. In fact, he realized the filth was water. Clean water. And he looked back. He had come from what looked like a pipeline. Above, he could hear something that gave him hope. Wonderful hope. People. Walking, talking, and enjoying themselves, it seemed. He tried to shout for help, but found it futile. He was too tired. His throat was painfully raw, and he could not catch his breath properly from... why? He couldn't quite think of why he was out of breath. Why was he down here? He looked around and found a door. Perhaps through there.
Aaron, will you come back to me, my love?
It was coming from the pipe. He leaned closer to the water to try and see. Black filth billowed out from the pipe along with long tendrils, blindly searching in the water.
Come back and admit your love to me. Admit that I am yours and yours alone, Aaron.
Aaron ran towards the only other exit, the blackness swirling around his legs as he wrenched the door open.
Please don't go, Aaron. There are other doors. Mine is always open.
He hesitated. This felt familiar.
Admit you loved me.
Fear and cowardice took hold of his mind. How could he have ever loved something so monstrous, something so hideous and filthy? No. This has to be the way out.
You can run from me, Aaron. But I'll be waiting for you.
He ran through the door.
We have until the end of time. And when the stars finally burn out...
This has to be the way out. This has to be...
I'll still